So thank you all very much for being here. Good morning. My name is Eve Riley, as Leslie said, and I work in the Health and Care Professionals and Practice team at AGK. And I led this piece of research that I'll be sharing with you today about understanding older people's experiences of urgent and emergency care. So for background, this research was commissioned through the VCSE Health and Wellbeing Alliance, and the fieldwork took place in the winter of 2024. But I think the learnings really do remain as relevant as we approach winter 2025. And our starting point for this work was really, I guess, the graph on this slide. So recognizing that, as Leslie was describing, many older people every day are admitted to hospital in an emergency for a condition that might have been treated earlier in the community or possibly prevented altogether. And a high number of older people are in this revolving door of readmissions. So they're coming back into hospital within 30 days of being discharged. But even though the great majority of ill health is concentrated in this population, older people's voices, older carers' voices, they're very rarely centred in debates about how we can tackle these challenges. And at AGK, we believe that older people and those who care for them have a really crucial role to play, like in understanding the issues, but actually also that any attempts to generate solutions are going to be strengthened by valuing and by drawing on that expertise. So that was really our starting point for this work. How can we build a picture of older people's experiences of the UEC pathway, but crucially in their own words? And because this is Malnutrition Awareness Week, I focused the presentation today on how nutrition and hydration factored into these stories specifically. And this issue came up many, many times, both in hospital settings, but it also came up in people's reflections about what had led them to hospital in the first place. But first, I just wanted to give you some background on the study design itself. So in total, we interviewed 29 older people. There was a broad age range. So our youngest participant was 65 years old, and our oldest was over 100 years old. And there was quite a mix of ages all the way between those 2 points. But other than age, the key inclusion criteria for participating in the study was that the person had been admitted for an ambulatory care sensitive or an urgent care sensitive condition. And they're conditions that are thought to be manageable generally in the community with the right types of care. So think things like COPD or a urinary tract infection. And they're also a category of conditions that represent a very high volume pathway for older people through UEC. The interviews were conducted by local AGKs, so the 5 AGKs listed on the slide there in different parts of England, and the interviews were recorded in older people's own homes. We recorded the interviews on a smartphone, so they're audio recorded, and in the final report you can click and listen and hear people speaking with extracts from those interviews. And I'm going to play a couple of the sound files today just so that you can get a sense of what that sounds like. And we also asked people to complete a survey alongside the long form interview. So this was really to get a better sense of people's social circumstances as well. So this slide is just summarizing some of that demographic data. So you can see that most of the participants in this study were living on a low fixed income. Most people we spoke to were worried about the cost of living. Most were taking multiple daily medications. So just under half of the group were taking between 6 and 10 medications every day. 3 people were taking 20 or more medications every day. Mobility among this group was very low. So just 3 people of the 29 were able to get out and about in the community independently. And most had been previously admitted to hospital in the past 12 months. Several people had been admitted multiple times, and actually one person had been admitted to hospital 6 times since September 2024. So I just thought it was useful to share this slide because I think when we reflect in the context of recognizing factors that raise risks of malnutrition and dehydration, I think it's really clear to see in this group that these older people face a range of risks that need to be managed. And as everyone on this call will know, those risk factors often overlap and interact. So moving on then to people's experiences in hospital, and I'm starting here with A&E. And I appreciate the slides are quite busy, so we'll share them afterwards, so don't feel you have to digest everything on the slide right now. But we saw many instances of what we term in the report failures to get essentials of care for frail older people right. So that includes nutrition and hydration, but also things like medicines management, upholding people's dignity, coordinating their care. And unfortunately, food and drink just didn't appear to be a priority in A&E. So hospital staff frequently had to be prompted by patients for a drink of water, sometimes many hours after arriving in A&E. And sometimes that only arrived when it was absolutely necessary, i.e. to take some medication. Many went without food for hours. And in some cases, that access was impeded because care was being delivered in the corridor, as Leslie described. And that's really important because we know for older people living with frailty, particularly, that dehydration or undernutrition can really quickly take effect, and it can have immediate and outsized consequences for that person and how they then go on to experience that hospital admission. One of the interesting findings for me in this section was that some patients didn't feel like it was the hospital's role to make sure they could access food and drink. And I found that interesting because I think it seems to reflect something about how perhaps we as a society separate eating and drinking from the realm of healthcare, perhaps where a hospital culture doesn't see this as a medical intervention. And then moving on to people's experiences once they've been admitted to hospital. Unfortunately, many of the older people we spoke to didn't feel well listened to. They didn't feel safe to ask questions. And very sadly, we identified quite a few issues where people were spoken to unkindly or in a bullying manner. And we termed this in the report an empathy gap between staff and patients. And I'll just play you a very short clip of one person's experience on a hospital ward.
Well, not this last one, the time before, there was a doctor there that was very nasty to me, as if I was a troublemaker and a problem causer.
Really?
And she was really nasty. Because I'd never been nasty to anybody. Or she said I kept interrupting her. And she was saying something wrong, and I was trying to explain to her.
Yeah.
So I don't call that interrupting as such, but she stopped her.
Right.
And young nurse came, a male nurse, he came along and we were talking. He said, "What's the matter?" I said, and I just said, "She's gone at me." I said, "And I don't do anything at anybody."
Yeah.
I said,
so that's just one small example, but it did feel to us that some staff had become a bit desensitized to how frightening a hospital admission can feel, particularly when you're in an emergency sort of set of circumstances, particularly when you're frail and older. And I think at the same time, pretty much all of the people we spoke to for this study were voicing concern for staff well-being. So they were noting how much pressure the workforce appeared to be under and suggesting that they simply didn't have time to support them with things like eating and drinking. But when we think about this empathy gap that I've described and how you can close it, I think actually a focus on food and drink is a really powerful way to show care, to help people feel safe. You know, making sure that people have access to food and drink that is the right kind of food and drink for them to eat, that is safe for them to eat, that they are able to eat, that they're encouraged to eat. That's a real way to demonstrate care and help to build trust. And I think the other major issue that was highlighted in hospital settings was this issue around siloed care, so care fragmentation. And patients were describing, for example, assessments that were brief, that had a tendency to focus on the presenting problem only, rather than taking time out to explore people's wider concerns. And that was a problem because many people felt that those wider issues were impacting on their current illness or actually were of a higher priority to them. So one good example of that in the report is Mary. So she was being treated in hospital for COPD, but couldn't get anyone to talk to her about the thing that was actually bothering her the most, which was incontinence. And And, you know, again, I think here a conversation about nutrition really could have helped to tease out some of her concerns, because it was clear that her anxiety about the incontinence was making her frightened to eat and drink. That in turn would be increasing her falls risk, her risk of a UTI, her overall risk of coming back in with another unplanned hospital admission. So to me, it doesn't make sense that we're separating out nutrition and hydration from clinical need in that way. And again, I think it's offering us a much more practical way to talk about some health concerns that older people commonly have. You know, it's inviting a more holistic, a more tangible conversation about the ways health problems are interacting with our daily lives. And then just moving on to discharge and aftercare. So when it comes to aftercare, we know that making sure people's nutrition and hydration are optimized is really key to supporting people to make a good recovery from hospital. But unfortunately, again, we were seeing some very worrying examples of where the transition between services was leading to quite steep cliff edges in care. So the next example is a woman who was discharged after having an extended stay in hospital, having broken her back. I'm just going to play you a short clip.
Obviously, you'd been in hospital for how many days was it again?
About 8.
8-9 days.
Yeah.
Right. So when you walked in, obviously the heating was
It was
off.
freezing.
Right. And then did anyone switch the heating
No.
on for you?
No.
They ask whether you had any food?
Well, I think I said to, I have no food in. Well, we can sort that.
But were you told that what's going to happen, how they were going to sort it?
No.
So the whole process, you weren't being informed about what's going on?
No, they just kicked me out. Literally kicked me out.
Okay. And when you came home and you were on the settee, did they put a blanket around you?
No,
Did
they just went.
just dropped your stuff and then just went? Right. Okay.
But it wasn't their job, was it, really?
Right.
I understand that. They're patient transport.
Of course.
So it's not their job to make sure I'm nice and warm.
I think on the more positive side of this, several of the people in the study we spoke to identified that because their hospital admission had been a shock, it had made them actually a bit more receptive to making lifestyle changes and to accepting help where maybe they wouldn't have before. So I think that tells us something about discharge from hospital being quite a powerful time potentially to put in place nutritional support, because some people just might for the first time feel that bit more receptive to it. So just to summarize on some of those messages then, I think this research shows why nutrition and hydration is such an essential component of healthcare for older people and that it deserves more attention and focus. I would characterize nutrition as a bit of an iceberg issue, often the cause or consequence of a bigger health problem for older people. And certainly when we asked participants if looking back they felt there were warning signs that their health had been deteriorating, they could identify clues. So for example, many people were citing a loss of appetite. Many people were talking about feeling tired, fatigued, finding it harder to get to the shops unaided, struggling to prepare meals. One woman described really struggling to be able to lift a full kettle to make a hot drink. Other people were describing the impact of their health conditions on their ability to eat and drink. So, for example, one person had some significant problems swallowing, and that was really impacting their enjoyment of food. So they were eating less, becoming tired. With becoming tired and having lower energy levels, that was making it harder for them to get out and about and see their friends and family. That was causing their mood to decline. So you can really see how that downward spiral is set up. And for others, a recent bereavement or other loss had really impacted their motivation to eat, their appetite. And so for those people, I think support with bereavement, some grief counselling, some support around loneliness, befriending, those types of interventions would probably be the best first step to addressing their malnutrition. So again, I just think this really shows that, you know, there are many reasons why people can become undernourished, and it's often multifactorial. So to end on a positive, I think the really good news from this study is that a focus on nutrition and hydration is shown to be both important in its own right, but also that it has a real role to play in addressing some of these other challenges identified in the report. So as I mentioned before, when we're thinking about siloed care, taking the time to understand whether a person is eating or drinking enough is a really good way to build trusting therapeutic relationships. And I think that will help get other bits and pieces right for the person too. You know, it helps to join the dots between health conditions that can be quite abstract and how they impact us and our lives practically. And I think when we think about how we bridge this empathy gap, a focus on nutrition is a really humanizing force, particularly in a clinical hospital setting. It's a way to show real care and compassion. I think it can tell us so much about somebody's daily rhythms and routines, you know, what's important to a person and why, what we like and what we dislike. If we're curious enough to ask, it's a really helpful way in. You know, something as simple as asking someone if they'd like a cup of tea offers real comfort and connection in a moment where you're feeling anxious or in pain or suffering. It's a really tangible way to uphold or to restore somebody's dignity. And recognizing those small preferences, you know, do you take sugar in your tea? Do you take milk? How do you like your tea? It can really make us feel seen and at home and safe in an otherwise quite unfamiliar setting. And I think with the shift towards neighbourhood health services aimed at keeping people well and living independently as long as possible, nutrition really does need to be a fundamental part of that vision. So you can access the full report by clicking on the link in this slide, and the slides will be available on the Malnutrition Task Force websites. But thank you very much, and please feel free to reach out to me if there's anything that you'd like to find out more about this study. It'd be really good to connect with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Wow. I would urge you to read the full report. It's quite enlightening, really. And I think it's important for us to note in UK Malnutrition Awareness Week is that still nutrition hydration is not really seen as a medical issue. It's not a priority. When we all know that good nutrition and hydration is fundamental to life and to living well. So we're lucky enough to have done this report through the Ambitions Partnership, and it's been shared with the Department of Health. And we've been in discussions with them, really talking about how important it is to have a good discharge plan in place, that it's important to raise the awareness throughout the patient's journey in hospital and in social care, because it's just not hospitals. It's also about social care, domiciliary care, and also what we, if we're carers, if we're family carers, how we promote nutrition and hydration. So I hope you enjoyed that. Well, if enjoy is the right word, but very informative report. So please do read it. Thank you, Eve.